Okay, members, the sitting is resumed. It is time for questions to the Minister of Finance. Maurice Bradley is not in his place, and I now call Diane Dodds.
Question number 2.
The legislation constrains the Executive in presenting a draft budget until at least a period of 14 days after a statement is laid before the Assembly, setting out our controlled totals as notified by the Secretary of State. That statement was formally laid on the 4th of November. I have undertaken a series of bilateral meetings with Executive Ministers on the budget, and my intention is to bring a draft budget to the Executive as soon as possible and present a draft budget to the Assembly once the Executive agreement is secured.
Supplementary, Diane Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, thank you for your answer, and I am glad to note that the Sinn Féin Finance Minister does intend to bring a budget to the Assembly at last. When officials were at the Education Committee the other week, they indicated that there would be a £350 million shortfall in their budget going on the baseline that has been provided for them. Will you make this cut to education, or will you prioritise children and young people in Northern Ireland?
Well, the member will know from the outcome of the spending review it is certainly not what the Executive requires in terms of the public services that we want to be able to offer to all the citizens that are from here. And certainly that has forced the Executive over a long number of years to start to prioritise what services it can afford to provide against those that it would like to provide. And obviously the primary recipient in that regard has always been health, although education has always come a close second. So I am very much aware, and I met with the Education Minister last week, very much aware of the challenges that there are in the Education Department, as there are across all public services, but it is particularly acute when it comes to children and young people who we want to give the best possible start in life to. So the decisions in relation to prioritisation and indeed in relation to the outcome of the draft budget will be for the Executive as a whole. I have spent the last while and will continue engaging individually with all Executive Ministers, as she will know from her own experience, to hear what their priorities are and the challenges that they face, and to try and stretch what is a limited budget, although we are pleased that it's over 3 years because it gives us the ability to do more planning, but to stretch that as best we can across the range of the priorities the Executive will have. But it will ultimately be for the Executive to decide that.
Steve Egan.
Much indeed, I thank the Minister for his answers so far. Minister, obviously we now have the opportunity for 3-year budgets going forward. Could the Minister explain to us what discussions he's had with ministers, and in some way how is he going to link this to the programme for government, or how is the budget going to be linked more properly to delivery from the programme for government?
Well, I have had over the last week or so, as I say, bilateral engagements with almost all of the Executive Ministers. I have a few still to go, and that we've had, as he knows, the pre-spending review outcome discussion at Executive level in terms of what our priorities would be before we were aware of the outcome of the spending review, what our priorities would be in the time ahead, how we would plan that over 3 years, how we would try and match that to a programme for government commitments and ensure that we have outcomes attached to that. So that is the challenge that lies ahead for the Executive. We have had the discussion largely with all of the ministers. My job will be then to bring a draft to the Executive, which would obviously seek Executive approval. Of course, that is a matter for the Executive themselves. And then, as he says, the ability to be able to plan over 3 years is something that we very much wanted, and so we will have to ensure that however we prioritise, and it is a stretch to try and fit in all of the priorities that ministers would want, that we do so in a way which does achieve some very tangible outcomes for the public that we represent.
Lisa McHugh.
Minister, given that the victims' payments will have to incorporate into the draft budget, can you confirm if the British Government has yet agreed to step up to the plate and honour its responsibility in relation to helping to fund this?
No, it hasn't as yet made that commitment. We are in dispute resolution with Treasury in relation to the issue of victims' payments. We have committed up front to ensure that those payments are met, so that no one who is potentially a recipient of that has to wait or be concerned that they would have to wait on such a payment coming through. But of course the issue of funding that is still a matter of dispute between the Executive and Treasury. I did raise this issue with the new Chief Secretary of the Treasury about a month ago when I met him, and I have to go back to him. The dispute resolution process has not yet completed, and I intend to get back to him in the very near future to try and secure an agreement for that. It is a very substantial cost on the Executive's annual funding at a time when our annual funding does not come anywhere close to that which we require in terms of providing decent public services.
Call Henry Muir.
Thus far. The Minister is now clear that we've got a multi-year budget ahead of us, and part of that there's an uplift in capital funding. But I have a concern about our ability to effectively spend that. In the context of this year, there's still capital funding which is unspent. What more is the Minister intending to do to ensure that the capital funding for the multi-year budget will be effectively spent? And can the Minister provide an update on the Infrastructure Commission, which the Executive agreed to establish?
Well, I'm not certain that there was capital money unspent this year, but I have to say that there is a report that was presented by the Audit Office into major capital programmes and how those could be improved. I know my own department had a role in responding to that, and I think there are lessons in that for all government departments to make sure that there is an improvement on the addressing of the issues that arose within that report. And we need to ensure that, because with a limited budget and so many competing priorities and projects indeed looking for capital and resource money, then the worst thing we could do is not spend that out properly. So there is a real onus on us to get that right. And if there are lessons coming from that Audit Office report, then we need to make sure that those are recognised and appropriate action is taken. In relation to the Infrastructure Commission, I know the Infrastructure Minister has raised issues around that. It will be a matter for the Executive to establish that, and I'm sure that they will get round to that in due course.
I call Ciara Ferguson.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Question 3.
I was delighted to announce at an event this morning that the Living Wage Foundation has now formally accredited the Executive as a living wage employer. While this fully delivers on this NDNA commitment, my department has also gone further by introducing a wider procurement policy that will see living wage included as a condition of contract for tenders from June 2022. Furthermore, my officials are also discussing with the Foundation how we can support their campaign to encourage more employers to pay a living wage.
Ciara Ferguson.
Thank you, Minister, for your answer thus far. The Minister, you will be aware of the invaluable role that our domiciliary care workers have played supporting our most vulnerable and our elderly, particularly as well during COVID. Despite this, they are often paid the minimum wage. So with the living wage policy, or will it apply to them?
Yeah, well, the living wage accreditation announced today for the Executive applies to civil service, and we are obviously encouraging and working with all public sector organisations to make sure that that rolls out through the public sector generally, where a lot of those care workers come in who do absolutely invaluable job, and that's, if not recognised before, certainly recognised over the course of the pandemic. And many are, as you say, being paid a minimum wage. That for new contracts, as part of the procurement rules that we have changed, for new contracts from June 2022, anyone who's securing a government contract under which they would be employed by various trusts will have to pay their staff the Living Wage Foundation living wage, which obviously will be a substantial increase on an hourly basis for those workers. So I think that is not just good news in terms of today's announcements for civil servants and public sector workers, but as we roll on into this and continue to do work on the living wage area, it will be good work for thousands of workers. Of course, there are a whole range of anti-poverty measures that are needed, and I think the Executive will have a role across all of those to try and ensure that people here, particularly in the time of this cost of living crisis, enjoy a decent standard of living.
I call Pat Cadney.
Minister, excuse me. Minister, we have seen the sharp energy price rise on the cost of living. You set out on your reasons for not taking action on the universal credit cut, but will you urgently convene a cost of living task force with the economy and community ministers to explore what more can be done to support people this winter?
Well, can I correct him first that the decision in relation to universal credit was taken by the Executive, not by myself. I think particularly members of your own party often credit me with more powers than I have, and if you have ever a proposition to give me more powers, I'd be very happy to receive it. But the reality is that decision was taken by the Executive. I'm very happy to work with other ministers in recognition that there is a cost of living crisis with us currently, and that the increased costs, particularly in terms of energy and food, are very real for very many families. So, however, the Executive, and there was to be a dedicated discussion on that. I know the Communities Minister has been pressing very much for that discussion to see what all parties can bring to the table in relation to that. So I'm very happy to play my part if there is such a proposition around that.
I call Paula Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Finance Minister. Just to go back to your last answer in relation to the awarding of contracts, I'm just wondering, will that include the community and voluntary sector who will be in receipt of government grants?
Yeah, we are looking at that issue again, and at the event this morning we had a discussion. It was not just a launch of this, we had actually a discussion with people from that sector, and there is a recognition that a lot of those contracts provided by the community and voluntary sector are very location specific. They know the geography of the area they're dealing with, they know the people of the area they're dealing with, and often there isn't enough recognition if these are awarded to larger firms who can simply come in with a lower cost. So there is a recognition, and measures are going to be included in procurement to ensure that we do recognise that the community and voluntary sector can provide a more effective service to local community. And whether that's done through a tender process or through a grant process, I think we have to ensure that the flexibility which is already there for departments and how they approach this is actually followed through on, to make sure that they get services that are provided in localities by people who have that experience and knowledge within those localities as well.
I call Mike Nesbitt.
Thank you. Just to be clear, has the Minister factored the national living wage into future departmental spending, and if so, what's the impact?
Yes, and we will have to. One of the leading officials, I think this morning at the event, said, yes, there is a cost attached to this, but it is the right thing to do. And the cost is actually, in overall terms for our budget, if the Living Wage Foundation wage has gone up just in the last day or so, so that will increase it, but it was in the region of the small number of millions of pounds. For the total number that we're talking about in the civil service, once you get out into the broader public service, of course, that will increase. But I think we have to recognise that if we want to lift people out of poverty, and there are all sorts of implications for public finances of people living in poverty, which include education, which include health, then these are some standards that we have to adopt. And I think it is the right thing to do. And in broader terms, it isn't a very substantial cost on the public purse, but it can have the effect of actually reducing dependency on other public services.
I call Colin McGrath.
Question number 4, Mr Speaker.
The Executive will shortly be preparing a draft budget for the next 3 years, following the outcome of the spending review. To inform the development of this draft budget, each department has been invited to make bids against a limited number of Executive priorities, including green growth and sustainability, which will also cover climate mitigation. It will then be for the Executive to determine what funding will be made available as part of the budget to help tackle climate change and support the transition to net zero.
Supplementary, Colin McGrath.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Minister, as we've seen at COP26, commitments in carbon reduction need action plans, and action plans require financing, whether that's for retrofitting of homes, overhauling public transport, or a just transition for those workers that are affected. Will you guarantee that the multi-year funding budgets that you will be setting in the coming months will have specific funding streams for the transition to net zero, so the public can judge the level of Executive commitment?
Well, again, it will be for the Executive to guarantee that, not myself. What we can do is, as I've invited the Executive to do at our planning session pre the spending review outcome, which again, as I remind the member, was disappointing, I've invited the Executive to set priorities, and one of the priorities I invited them to set was around green growth and sustainability, and in making submissions in order to allow me to draft a budget to make bids against some of those priorities. That was one of the priorities. So we have had interest, of course, from a range of departments who have a responsibility in that matter. And so the Executive will have to set that priority against competing priorities as well, in terms of health, in terms of inequalities, in terms of economic growth and sustainability and skills and all of the other areas. I'm sure when it comes to a budget debate here, people will be reminding us that we should have prioritised. But of course, there are commitments that have been made to transition to net zero, and the Executive will have to try and match those commitments in terms of its spending.
The Minister's demonstrated his intent to utilise public spending for public good by incorporating social value requirements into the procurement process. Can the social value element also include a focus on climate change?
Well, certainly one of the elements of the social value that people will have to demonstrate, and that will be 10% of the contract value from next June and move on up to 20% the following June in 2023. One of those elements can and should be environmental. And so there is an opportunity for people to actually make that contribution. So it's not just simply about the measures the Executive are doing through public funding themselves, but also how they're utilising the procurement power to ensure that other sectors come in and make environmental contributions as well.
Mr.
Speaker, there is financial pressures on health, and as been indicated earlier, financial pressures on education, and indeed many government departments. But we also have two different climate change bills before us, and the outcomes of that will be additional pressures, either in terms of supporting change or perhaps pressures to mitigate those who have been adversely affected. So will the Minister accept that there is a need to record the cost of what we're doing and to ensure that there is a budget set aside to enable our movement towards a UK net carbon zero?
Well, I think it is incumbent on us to try and ascertain the costs as best we can, and to make sure, as I say, if this is, and I'm recommending it is a priority for the Executive, that we have resources to meet our targets. And the Executive has set itself targets, and we're not just doing this alone. We're obviously a part of a global attempt, limited and fractious perhaps as it may be, coming from COP26, but certainly attempt and responsibility to try and transition to net zero for future generations. So, of course, we have to try and match the resources that are required to do that and understand the costs that are associated with doing that. But we set that against a whole range of priorities, as he understands, and has outlined some of them in health and education and protecting vulnerable people, economic recovery as well. And we have to try and stretch what is a limited resource, even though it allows us to plan over 3 years, but to stretch that resource across that range of challenges. I would hope that, as he has referenced, that there are two bills currently going through the Assembly, that there is some attempt to have a meeting of minds and that to get something that everyone can buy into, which does do what needs to be done in the time ahead in terms of climate change.
Kelly Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, thank you so much for your questions so far, but I would like to ask you what considerations have been given to seeking the ability to levy a carbon tax on all fossil fuel companies' emissions?
Something at that level would be done by Treasury, so it would be ultimately a question for them. Whatever we can manage in our more limited role here, the Fiscal Commission is currently looking at various tax raising and levying powers, and I have been prescriptive with them in terms of what they might look at, and I'm eagerly awaiting a kind of draft report to make sure that we can have this debate. And of course, a final report will be then a matter for an incoming Executive to consider legislating for. So, but I think the ability to put carbon tax on large fossil fuel companies, and that would be something that would more than likely originate from Treasury.
I call Liz Kimmins.
Question 5, please.
The spending review outcome was better than feared, but less than what we needed. I've set out the details of the spending review settlement in my written ministerial statement, but I would like to make comment about the increase in the Executive's budget for the 3-year period ahead. Much has been made of the Chancellor's announcement of £1.6 billion extra per annum for the Executive, but the Chancellor was referring to additional amounts compared to a baseline that was significantly lower than the actual budget for 21-22. It's more accurate to compare the budget envelope for the next 3 years to the Executive 21-22 budget, and when that comparison is made, the funding is much lower than the £1.6 billion per annum. In fact, comparing to the 21-22, the resource budget shows no increase in real terms by the time we reach 2024-25. The capital budget is somewhat better, with a 2.1% real terms increase by 24-25.
Liz Kimmin, supplementary.
I'm going to thank the Minister for his response. Would the Minister agree that the British Government's refusal to cut VAT on energy bills as part of the spending review represents another attack on hard-pressed workers and families who are already struggling in the face of a cost of living crisis?
Well, there's no doubt, as I responded to previous questions, that we are in a cost of living crisis, and I think it is incumbent on all of us, the Executive, within whatever limited resources we have, to try and pull those together to try and ensure that we can help families as best we can. I certainly know the Communities Minister is very exercised. She does have programmes which can assist people, particularly with winter heating, but those are limited, and the additional Barnett consequential that we may receive from the Treasury is well short of what we spent on this last year. So I did write to the Chancellor in relation to the VAT issue, in relation to energy bills. We will see what comes out of that. I know it is a complex issue, but I know there are other governments in other areas that have been looking at this. Certainly a temporary waiver on those bills to recognise the climate that we're currently in.
I call Matthew O'Toole.
Mr Speaker, Minister, in June, you, having written to the Chancellor, you said it is essential that the British Government delivers a multi-year budget, as this will enable the Executive to strategically plan the delivery of public services. On the same day in June, the Health Minister launched his framework to deliver reductions in waiting lists, but that only delivered targets or set out targets to 2026. The spending review runs to 2025. People in this place will completely lose even more confidence with us if the budgets we set don't match quickly to reducing waiting lists. When you assign money, and I agree that health should be a priority, can you commit that the targets will not just be to 2026, but there will be earlier targets for reducing waiting lists, not just at the end of this 3-year budget period we have, but in the years in the middle of it, so that people can actually see what those targets are and whether we are delivering against them?
Well, I think he makes a fair point. The health budget has increased year on year, but yet the problems within health, as we all have experienced or witnessed over the last number of days, continue to grow. And so I would be very committed to resourcing health to try and make the transformative changes that are needed in order to properly fund our health service, but also to reduce down the cost of the public purse, the provision of that health service. And of course, improving public health is not just simply a matter for the Department of Health. There are a range of departments. Indeed, all of us have a contribution to make in that regard. But I do think it is incumbent when the Executive, and it may well be the case, the draft budget is yet to be set, it may well be the case that other departments are asked to contribute to that outcome. Then I think people will want to know what we're getting for that contribution. Not just in terms of giving more cash to health, but actually understanding the objectives that we all want to see in terms of elective care and a range of other measures, then how that is being met. And I think shorter term, medium term targets in relation to that, I think would be a very helpful approach, and it's something that I would be very content to consider. I know that discussion is ongoing at the moment, because I think if we are collectively, and I don't just mean by the Executive, I mean by the Assembly as a whole, to allocate a very significant chunk of our resources to health, because it's absolutely necessary to do that, and we are dealing with the consequences of years and years of austerity budgets and trying to support a service that is in crisis, then I think we have to see what the transformative outcome of that is over a number of years, and it is, I think, appropriate to measure that as we go along.
I call Robbie Butler.
Question number 6, Mr Speaker.
Support for this bill and the accelerated passage process were agreed by the Executive on the 21st of October. This is not ordinary legislation, it is an emergency measure being introduced purely to mitigate against significant financial risk. Failure to bring this legislation through could result in revenue losses to both the Executive and to district councils, up to £255 million over a 3-year period from April 2020 to March 2023. The Department has taken legal advice on its obligations to consult, and for this specific bill, which addresses an urgent taxation matter, there is neither a statutory obligation nor a legitimate expectation to consult. Additionally, a consultation should not be undertaken if it is not going to be meaningful. In this case, there is no outcome of a consultation on the bill that could change the need for it or the intent or nature of that legislation. But I can confirm that the equivalent legislation in England, Wales and Scotland has also been introduced without consultation.
Supplementary, Robbie Butler.
thank the Minister for his answer, and he will I'm sure, agree with me that some non-domestic ratepayers will be concerned, as will other stakeholders. In relation to significant stakeholders, and in particular local councils, what confidence can you give to them that fiscal pressures will not be forced down onto them in terms of any resultant outcomes of the bill?
Well, that's precisely the point of the bill, is to make sure that we do deal with the potential fiscal pressures. This was a device which was intended to deal with some local specific issues, but now can be used in terms of a global pandemic, and that was never its intention. And so we're actually moving very specifically in that regard to protect the public purse from any loss in that fashion. And I do intend to, and we are discussing with council finance officers, and I do intend to discuss with business organisations in the very near future. But obviously our ability to consult anyone was undependent on the Executive's outcome in terms of their approval for the bill to be taken forward, which was only a short few weeks ago. So, yes, we have no intention of absorbing a cost, and that's therefore there would be no intention of passing that on to local government.
Robbie Butler, supplementary. Oh, already had your supplementary. I've been very generous this afternoon. I call Keith Buchanan.
So far for his answers. Minister, my understanding is over 2,000 businesses have appealed their NAV based on coronavirus being an issue. If this bill passes, what happens to those 2,000 businesses?
Well, we are hoping that there is associated with the bill, which has originated in Westminster and, as I say, is going through Wales and Scotland in a very similar fashion to the one that we have adopted, that there is some compensatory factor available to us, which will come across as a Barnett consequential. And if that is the case, and we certainly hope it's the case, and we're testing that at the moment with Treasury, then we would try and ensure that businesses do get some recompense for that. But the consequence of it not doing anything is a much greater cost on the public purse, which would ultimately impact on our ability to move on things like rates, in terms of looking at business rates and looking at some of the rates interventions we make in terms of small business support and manufacturing support. So that type of a hit on the public purse would probably have longer-term consequences for rates in a negative sense than perhaps this issue in terms of those businesses.
Call Sheeran.
And I thank the Minister for his answers thus far. Many businesses really benefited from the 2-year rates holiday as part of the package of support for businesses during the pandemic. Does the Minister expect that there will be further rate support in the incoming financial year?
Well, the rates support that was provided was largely done from the COVID money that we received from Treasury, so we don't have that level of money going into the next financial year. But nonetheless, we have asked the University of Ulster Economic Policy Unit, who did provide us with some advice and guidance and supporting evidence in relation to how we tailored the rate package after the initial 4 months, to give us some further advice as to what sectors specifically are continuing to suffer as a consequence of the pandemic. A lot of retail and hospitality have been opened up, albeit with ongoing restrictions, but some sectors in particular are suffering as a consequence of that. So we are looking at which sectors are continuing to sort of feel the weight of the impacts of COVID and see if there's anything that we can do to support them in the new financial year. But that will very much depend on the budgets that are available to us.
Call Jim Allister.
The Minister describes this as not ordinary legislation. He's certainly right about that, because it combines in a most toxic mix that which is retrospective and absolutely no consultation. And then the Minister wants to add to that the third component of accelerated passage. So he wants to bring legislation which is retrospective, which denies appeals, which has been no consultation with the sector about, and he wants to ram it through this House. Is that not a triple lock of unaccountability?
Well, I think it is absolutely prudent when we recognise that there is significant risk to the public purse that we take steps to address that. If we didn't, I have no doubt that the member would be very vocal in his criticism of inaction. It's not ordinary legislation. I don't like the idea of accelerated passage, and I certainly do intend, now that we have executive approval, to go ahead to consult with business sectors and others to make sure that people understand what we're doing. But I think even he understands that the legislation which currently exists, which allows this, was not designed for a global pandemic. It was designed for specific local instances where people lost the value of their property, and this was clearly not what this was designed for. And we have a responsibility to try and protect public purse in light of all of the conversations which we've been having for the last half hour about the pressures on public services.
That ends the period for a list of questions, members, and we now move on to 15 minutes of topical questions, and I call Andrew Muir.
The Minister has been on record in supporting increased funding going towards health. I want to ask the Minister, does his definition extend beyond the Department of Health to other departments, recognising that preventative measures are often more cost-effective, reduce health inequalities and also future demand upon our health and social care system?
Yes, I do recognise that, although obviously the lion's share of our health spend is within the health department, but there are certainly actions which can be taken in other departments which can contribute to good health and good mental health, all of which I think reduce down in the demand on health services and make sure that, and some of the anti-poverty measures we talked about earlier also make a contribution in that regard, transport measures and a range of measures. So all departments, I do think, have a responsibility in this regard, and that's why I think the Executive, as a collective, prioritised health, because they recognise it wasn't just the area for the health department itself, but we all had a responsibility. We had a responsibility to try and fund it, but we all had a responsibility to deliver, and that's why we invited departments to bid in the run-up to this draft budget stage. We invited all departments to bid in relation to the health issue.
Supplementary, Andrew Muir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his reply. And I think this is crucial in terms of the three-year budget ahead. But as the Minister said in his response, the lion's share will go to the Department of Health. But I'm also conscious that it's 5 years since the Bingo report was published, and the enactment of those reforms has been slow. Is consideration being given towards tying the increased funding to the Department of Health upon the requirement to enact those necessary reforms to ensure patients across Northern Ireland get the good quality care they deserve?
Health is committed to the process of reform. The Health Department is, and health ministers, current and previous ones, have been committed to that process of reform. One of the things we have suffered from is annual budgets don't allow the necessary planning or the recurrent funding to make sure you can ensure that you recruit enough staff, for one thing, to cover that responsibility and to make sure that those reforms can carry on over a number of years. So, of course, I think the health is already committed to that. But if, as I said in response to an earlier question, if the Executive is, particularly if we're in the situation where other departments are making a contribution, we will want to understand that the programme of reform is being followed through and that we're getting that, because there is a recognition, and health recognise this as much as anybody, to leave things unchanged for the next period over a number of years would result in an ever-increasing, I suppose, contribution from the entire block grant into health alone, and that's not sustainable in the longer term. So reforms are absolutely necessary for the system itself, but also for our public finances.
Murphy.
Collier, and I'd like to thank the Minister for his answers this far. Minister, you've previously highlighted the need to ensure community groups have a level playing field when bidding for contracts, particularly when it involves delivering community-based services. Can you provide an update on the work you are doing to ensure that this is the case? Well,
we're doing this through the procurement board, which I reconstituted and brought a range of people in so we could get some voices in there who hadn't previously been heard, but also people from some practitioners to make sure that we had that level of expertise in the procurement board. We did make a recent addition. We brought people in from the voluntary and community sector as well to make sure we already had social enterprise and to make sure their voices are heard. And one thing we've heard loud and clear from community projects is that they have spent years providing services, particularly in areas like mental health and health support to communities, only to find themselves outbid for some of those contracts by organisations who have much deeper pockets and have come in and in some cases have subcontracted the services back out to the community, voluntary and community sector who were doing the job in the first place. So they end up doing the same job for less money. But they have built up, obviously, the local connections, the knowledge, the interactions with people in the area and that confidence in terms of providing the service. So we have said through procurement very clearly to departments they have the flexibility to look at awarding grants rather than awarding tenders. They can look at how services are provided. Of course, you want top-class services. You want to make sure that those services are working for people. But there is that flexibility. But through our own procurement guidance that we are bringing through the Executive bit by bit, we are ensuring that that is hammered home. And there is guidance, a paper to go to the Executive, I'm hoping tomorrow, which will reinforce that message.
Supplementary, Anya Murphy.
Minister. I was delighted to hear that the Executive has secured accreditation as a living wage employer. this morning. Will this now extend to the procurement policy?
Well, that is part. Firstly, it's been brought in through the executive for all civil service workers, and it affects, I think, something in the region of 300 or 400 civil service workers to bring them up to that level of living wage. But through procurement, what we have agreed to do, and that's been approved by the executive, is to ensure from next June any new contracts that are being awarded are done so on the basis that people who are getting government contracts ensure that they pay a living wage, foundation standard living wage to the people that they employ.
Well, Harry Harvey.
For his answers thus far. The Minister will be aware that all departments are engaged to tackle climate change. Could the Minister outline what financial support he has provided to the Department for Infrastructure to address this?
Well, the Department of Infrastructure will be one of a range of departments, and what we have done is, as part of the pre-planning exercises before we knew the outcome of the spending review, we presented to the various executive colleagues that we believe there was a range of priorities that the executive should engage with, health being one obviously, but green growth and recovery, sustainable economic growth as well, issues around, as I say, tackling inequalities. And we invited departments to make bids against those. So the Department of Infrastructure would have been invited to make bids against those priorities. And in doing that, we will get a sense of the contribution that departments want to make over the next 3 years. But also then we have to match that against the resources we have for those departments over the next 3 years.
Supplementary, Harry Harvey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister for his answer so far. Minister, you'll be aware that there is a growing demand for electric vehicles, charging points especially. I'm just wondering, do you have plans to commit additional budget for this going forward, this incoming year? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I do know it's something that the Department of Infrastructure have been looking at in terms of how they do it. We have also offered to the Department of Infrastructure, and I heard the Minister for Infrastructure the other day when she was answering yesterday. She was answering questions about the transport meeting that she was on, saying that we have also offered to look at the building regulations to see, do we include charging points within new buildings. So some of it would be financial contributions, but there are other things we can do to make sure that the electric charging infrastructure is enough to support people, to encourage people to make the move from fossil fuel powered vehicles into electric charged vehicles. So we need to make sure that those incentives are there, and that some of the issues which would have people concerned, like access to charging, are dealt with. So through things like building regulations, we can make a contribution for the Department of Finance, as well as looking at some financial contribution.
Kelly Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, could I ask if you could clarify for the House what your role is with regards to Fresh Start money and what management your department may have over that money?
Well, the Fresh Start money has generally been earmarked as part of an agreement, so in a large extent it's ring-fenced. We would obviously liaise with the NIO, through whom the Fresh Start money came, to make sure that we access that we can include it in our budgets. But it is earmarked for a range of matters. Some of it was actually health transformation money. Some of it was money that we spent with TEO and tackling paramilitarism and other areas. So it wouldn't be a matter that we take a pot of the NIO and then decide to make recommendations on its allocation to Department of Finance. It was agreed by the parties with the British Government for a range of areas, and so in that regard, it's still in and it will be included in our budgets this year, but it is very largely ring-fenced into those areas.
Supplementary, Kelly Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, I'm aware that the Minister for Education had been to the Treasury and had got agreement for reprofiling some of the Fresh Start money. I have concerns that there are 17 integrated education schools that are currently in planning and have been told that they will proceed. Is there any risk to those schools?
Well, it would be actually the Department of Finance would engage with Treasury on these issues, and I know specifically on the Stroul Shared Education campus we have been speaking to Treasury about reprofiling money there. So we want to ensure that where there was capital money, particularly for education, also for housing, there was capital money as well for shared housing, that if it isn't going to be spent out the time ahead, we do engage with Treasury to try and reprofile that to make sure that that money is not lost.
Paul Ploncamer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister recently wrote to the Treasury requesting a temporary waive on VAT costs and energy bills to help families and businesses struggling with soaring bills. Has the Minister received an update on this request to date?
No, we haven't as yet. I think the letter went last week. Judging by the time sometimes Treasury takes to respond to us, but I would be hoping for an early response to that, because I'm very firmly of the view that we are in the midst of a cost of living crisis now, and that any steps which can be taken, including things like waiving VAT on energy bills, should be explored by the government. I think it would make a contribution. There are contributions that the executive can make as well, and I think it's incumbent on us to find ways to do that. But certainly, I think Treasury could make a major contribution in terms of VAT on energy bills.
Tom Cameron, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank the Minister for his answer so far. The 10 towns network area, which includes Antrim, my hometown and my constituency, will increase prices by 38% in December. Other major companies like SSE Electricity and Power and I have also announced large increases in gas and electricity bills. Has the Minister had any discussions with the Communities Minister around the potential need for further welfare support for those being pushed into debt and financial poverty, with this added pressure on energy bills?
Yes, I have. I know that she's very exercised about this, because this, last year there was support was required for people with energy bills over the winter, and we had more money in the pot to do it then, perhaps because of some of the COVID money we had as well. And this year the price hike has come in very suddenly in terms of gas and then electricity as well. So that is put it in a very, very significant, and you identify the costs associated with that. So she is very concerned. I have had discussions with her. We are of the view that we would want to see, perhaps ahead of the next redistribution point we have for any funding available is January. At that stage, people might already be in crisis in this regard. So we are considering discussing with other departments that perhaps know now what they may be surrendering in January, to see can we get some agreement at the executive to put that towards this cost of living crisis that we're currently in now. That will depend on what returns are coming back from departments, but we are trying to identify some steps that we can take in advance of getting deep into the winter to try and see is there a way to address some of these. The Minister already has a number of schemes which he can allocate funding out to support people in terms of their home heating costs, but I think last year we had put an additional 50 million. I think this year it looks like we've got an additional 12 or 13 million. That clearly is not going to be adequate in the time ahead when you add in the increase in energy costs.
Paula Bradley.
Minister, recently we received correspondence from the Minister of Communities around the Shared Prosperity Fund, and I know that you've taken the lead on this, and I know you're proactively taking the lead on this also. Can you let us know, are we making any headway at all on this?
Well, we're trying to analyse the outcome of the I think it was the Community Renewal Fund and the funding that recently came here. As you know, I know you've been following this, we've been repeated representations. Treasury, Scotland and Wales have made exactly the same representation, that this is funding projects and schemes in our area that doesn't take any account of the executive's priorities. We have no function or role into. We got this offer of some very high-level contributions to say, did this meet our priorities or did it not meet our priorities, which we had no sense of whether that actually secured the funding, or if we said it didn't meet our priorities, we might have knocked a project out of getting funding, and that money wasn't coming back to us to allocate to other priorities. So we've been trying to analyse the first run of funding in relation to this, and we, to be quite honest, we don't have any rhyme or reason to how the funding was allocated. As a matter of fact, the three projects that got actually the most in terms of the share going to other projects didn't come past the executive for any view at all. And one of them was a call centre based in Oxford. I'm not sure how it got funds attributed to us, whatever services it provides here. So it is very, very unsatisfactory. And we will continue to make representation. I have asked for some analysis to be done of the outcome of that funding allocation. I try and get some sense, because they don't come through us, so we don't have a sense of who applied and didn't get. But to try and get some analysis, I've spoken to the Scottish Finance Minister in recent times, and she's doing something similar. I have no doubt Wales will do that. We will go back again and present to Treasury and say this is not working for us. What we require in terms of particularly lost EU funding is that that money comes to us. This institution decides the priorities and we allocate accordingly, not in this kind of random way that has been done to date.
A really brief supplementary. Paula Bradley.
Thank the Minister for his answers. To be very brief then, we know that many of our funding streams require match funding with EU funding. Has there been any scoping exercises done to look at that match funding and how that the shortfall in that, whether that is through match funding through the executive or match funding through other people not in government?
Of any of these projects would get, and I don't think it could be the case that they would apply for funding this on the basis that they have match funding from us, because we're not in that application process. We did, over the course of last year, replace funding that we had lost through the EU, and the previous economy minister would know that we had to replace skills funding that was lost through the European Social Fund, but that was at our own expense, and we have to do that again this year. It will be from the Executive's own budgets.
Time's up, members, and members please take your ease for a moment or two before we move on to the next item.
And also to the Minister, since he's still here.
Thanks very much, Dad. Thank you, Morris. Thank you.